A thick, bound volume with 386 large pages, 23 centimeters by 36.2 centimeters. Most of the pages have 4 framed columns filled with exquisite Arab calligraphy. 34 of them are illustrated with opaque watercolor paintings in vivid colors. Other pages are decorated with illuminations. The volume was acquired in the 19th century in Tehran, capital of the Kingdom of Persia, now Iran. Since 1877, it has been housed in the Oriental Manuscripts Department of the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. Called Khamseh, meaning quintuplet, the book contains the 5 treasures, 5 epic poems written by the great Persian poet of the 12th century, Nizami. A painting of the manuscript shows him with his protector. No doubt influenced by Persian mystical currents, Nizami left thousands of verses written in a refined style. The second poem in the pentology, Khusro and Shirin, recounts the love story of Prince Khusro, who became the king of Persia, and Princess Shirin, his future wife and Christian daughter of the Queen of the Armenians. Only 9 episodes in this long poem are illustrated with miniatures. Shirin goes in search of the prince on her black horse, Shabdiz. She makes a stop and bathes in a spring. Khusro sees her for the first time. They pursue each other but never find one another. Later, Khusro, who has become king, is overthrown by the usurper Bahram. Khusro stays in Shirin's palace. He spends many days with her. She loves him but resists him. During a festival, Khusro confronts and kills a lion that has approached the ceremonial tent. Shirin has taken refuge in Byzantium. She still refuses to give herself to Khusro, whom she enjoins to chase away the usurper. Khusro marries Mariam, the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. Then he wages war on Bahram, defeats him, and kills him. But he longs for Shirin and sends for her. She has become the queen of the Armenians. She refuses to come. She pays a visit to the architect Farhad. He has built a canal and an ornamental lake in the mountains which fill up with ewe's milk. The architect is in love with Shirin. There is another visit. Farhad receives Shirin and carries the exhausted horse which has just collapsed as well as its rider. Khusro, who is increasingly jealous, sends a messenger to convince Farhad that Shirin is dead. The architect, on hearing the news, falls dead. Mariam is dead. Khusro marries the beautiful Shakar in Isfahan. Vexed, Shirin prays to heaven for Khusro's return. Her prayers are answered. Khusro arrives at Shirin's palace during a hunt. There is amorous conversation, but Shirin still resists. At an important reception, a musician sings for Shirin, another for Khusro. Shirin finally agrees to marry him. There is a wedding celebration. Khusro and Shirin are united in their palace. The artist prefers to represent them in a garden of paradise in the middle of which is a spring. While he sleeps by Shirin's side, Khusro is killed by Shiroye, the son he has with Mariam. Shirin refuses Shiroye's advances and stabs herself during the king's funeral. Nizami was inspired by a real person who had lived 6 centuries before him, Khosroes Parviz, the Victorious. He was the king of Sassanid Persia from 591 to 628 and a contemporary of Muhammad. Initially the ally of the Byzantines, he later became their enemy. The Byzantine emperor finally defeated him at Nineveh. This is the episode Piero della Francesa depicted in one of his frescoes in Arezzo. 23 years after the death of Khosroes, the Arabs invaded Persia, the Sassanid dynasty disappeared, and Islam replaced the Zoroastrian cult. Islam emerged in Arabia in 622 AD. It was opposed to idol worship and emphasized an uncompromising monotheism. God is without form and omnipotent. Representing God was seen as an act of idolatry. A person who produced a likeness of a living creature, human or animal, was seen as seeking to rival God. Human figures were gradually banned from religious buildings and public places, but they lived on in private places and especially in illuminated books. Persia did not adopt printing until the 19th century, so manuscripts were the only means of circulating the written word. The Shah's library workshop collected and made copies of the Quran, chronicles, picture books, and academic treatises. The works of the philosophers, doctors, geometers, and architects of ancient Greece were circulated in Arabic translations. The library also held the great classics of Persian literature, which often existed in multiple versions. The reputation of Persian books, their trade and export, resulted in the emergence of numerous other workshops, home to calligraphers, bookbinders, and painters, but also to papermakers, dyers, gilders, and paintmakers. Paper made from plant fibers, a Chinese invention, was used throughout the Islamic world from the 8th century onwards. The manuscript is made of laid paper, which may have been imported from India, and is folded into 16-page folios. The overseer decided on the mastar, a sheet of card or of wood upon which silk threads were stretched. This was placed underneath a sheet of paper and rubbed so that the silk threads left a slightly raised pattern on the paper. The mastar determined the spacing of the lines, columns, the margins, illuminations, and even of the illustrations. Texts and pictures were sometimes laid out on paper that was stenciled, dyed, marbled, or even sprinkled with gold. The manuscript was made using a very fine powdered gold. The next step was the jadwal, a series of color fillets and black lines that formed the frames of the text or the pictures. Although there are a few minor defects, smudges, uneven joins, it would appear the lines were made using drawing pens filled with ink or opaque watercolor. The folios were then given to the kateb, or calligrapher, who was often also the overseer. Muslims believed writing was a gift from God, who taught it directly to Adam, and considered calligraphy as the noblest art form. Early angular scripts were replaced by cursive styles with wide curves, drawn-out downstrokes and upstrokes. In the 11th century, Ibn Mukhla, minister of the Abbasid court, had codified calligraphy along geometric lines. The kalam is the reed sharpened according to strict rules. The square point, which corresponds to the tip of the kalam, is the basic unit of measurement. It determines the size of the first letter of the alphabet, the alif, which is between 3 and 12 points high, depending on the schools and styles. And the alif is taken as the diameter of the circle in which other letters are written. Each page has 4 columns of 20 lines of calligraphy. The poetry is composed of a series of distichs, or couplets, spread over 2 successive columns. The Khamseh includes almost 30,000 distichs. The manuscript is written in Nastaliq, a script that appeared in Persia at the end of the 14th century. Legend has it that its inventors saw Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, in a dream. Ali showed him a flock of wild geese in flight, the model for this cursive script with flowing lines, sometimes written diagonally, sometimes forming chevrons. At the end of 4 of the poems, the calligrapher wrote, "The copying of these sheets was completed in the month of Safar, in the year 1034 of the Hegira of the Blessed Prophet. It was made by the sinner's slave Abd al-Jabbar, whom God absolves." This famous calligrapher is known to have written several other pieces, including a divan dating from 1620. The manuscript bears many other signatures, those of its various owners, that of the binder who signed his name in the middle of a flower in the 18th century, and that of a 19th century calligrapher who wrote, "No eye has ever beheld such a book." An illustration of another poem in the collection shows Khosrow's grandfather wandering about the countryside in the company of his vizier. The walls of a building in ruins are covered in very fine graffiti. They are poems. This is where the miniaturist hid his signature. Written by the humble slave Haidar Koli Nakach in the year 1032. The year 1032 of the Hegira or Muslim era corresponds to the year 1622 or 1623 of the Christian era. 2 of the 5 poems, including Khosrow and Shirin, bear the mark of a village near Baghdad in the region of Khorasan. An inscription above a door proclaims, "Whomsoever possesses existence is a friend of Ali and of the family of Ali." Friend of Ali is written Moheb Ali, and Moheb Ali was the name of a wealthy governor of a district of Khorasan. He may have summoned the artist from the royal workshop in Isfahan, but the inscription could have been an invocation. Ali is the son-in-law of the Prophet, the first Imam. This is what the Shiite sect, the predominant branch of Islam in Persia, claimed. The quality of the manuscript seems to suggest it may have been commissioned by royalty. Shah Abbas I transferred the capital to Isfahan. A warrior and skilled politician, the Shah also commissioned many buildings. The architecture and ornamentation of his day featured many of the motifs appearing in his painters' miniatures. These artists also designed cartoons for carpets, tiles, wood paneling, and textiles. The pictures in the manuscript are about 22 centimeters high. The figures are 5 centimeters tall. The face is barely 7 millimeters. Their eyes are 1 millimeter wide and their pupils less than 1/3 of a millimeter. Some pictures in Persian manuscripts were abandoned at the drawing stage. Axes and structures drawn with a ruler, lines redrawn several times, gradual and harmonious arrangements of forms or of surfaces to be colored. The artists used simple opaque watercolors. Gum arabic was the main type of binder. Most of the pigments had been used all over the Mediterranean basin since antiquity. White lead, orpiment yellows, yellow ochre, saffron, minium realgar or cinnabar oranges, red lacquers made from plants or obtained from crushed cochineal insects, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Badakhshan, azurite and indigo. Greens were obtained by mixing orpiment and indigo. Likewise, white lead and indigo made light blue. White lead and minium made the pink used for the skin. And lapis lazuli, cinnabar and lacquer were used to make violet. Gold and silver leaf or solution were also frequently used, painted in silver, springs, rivers and canals have oxidized and are now blackish. In some areas, the subjacent layers can be seen, where the top layers of paint have flaked off. This proves that the painter covered the surfaces with a light primer before applying the color. Only then did he fill in the details: facial features, clothes, flowers, motifs of the textiles and buildings. Next, he outlined the objects or figures with black ink to emphasize their contours. Certain tiny repetitive motifs took many hours to complete. A single illustration would require months of work. The artists like to show their skills with very fine brushes. Hence the abundance of hair, and moustaches represented strand by strand, of hats with aigrettes, or exquisitely patterned textiles or carpets. Several pictures show us the miniaturists and calligraphers at work. Once finished and dry, the paintings were finely polished until they were as smooth and shiny as enamel. Colors were usually chosen at random. Painters tried to use a broad range of colors, but certainly did not attempt to represent the hues of the real world. So, in the scene of spring, the sky is painted gold, and beneath it there are nearly 20 colors. Painters did not represent shadows. They made no distinction between night and day. Nor did they have any particular technique for modeling the figures. However, some objects, such as rocks, were made with touches of wash paint so that they appeared vaguely three-dimensional. The viewpoint is always raised, as if the scenes were seen from a mountain, a tower, or the sky. It is a sort of divine viewpoint. The painter sometimes suggests successive planes, but he does not appear to have taken distance into consideration. The two figures and their horses are the same size. The clumps of flowers in the foreground are identical to those in the background. Even with distance, there is no gradation in the brightness of colors. A building is a simple rectangle. The canal built by Farhad is seen from above, whereas the figures and the mountains are in profile. In the scene of the wedding night, the two lovers are in profile, but the bed, seen from above, is merely a rectangle. This style of painting was not a form of naivety, it was an artistic choice. Perspective techniques had existed in earlier periods, as far back as the Greco-Roman times. The painter shows he knows how to apply them, as is shown by the hexagonal throne of Khosrow, the roof of the palace, and the two candle holders in the murder scene. Several pictures extend beyond their borders. This paradoxical opening of the frame became a classic feature of Persian miniatures. The image within an image was another popular feature. Frescoes are painted on the walls of the palace, and some of these evoke other episodes in the book. Although the battle scenes are reminiscent of the large stone bas-reliefs of Taki Bostan depicting the hunts and battles of Khosrow and other Sassanid kings, the painter has transposed them to his century. The horses have stirrups. The costumes are those of the beginning of the 17th century. The warriors' movements are accurate. The shepherds wear the caps of the period. In the lion scene, the courtiers wear the style of hat that became fashionable during Shah Shabbas I's reign. However, several details are treated in a rather unrealistic way. This is true of the clouds, which are painted like flames in the manner of Chinese paintings. And of the trees, which are sometimes stylized in the extreme. Lastly, as in medieval Byzantine pictures, no distinction is made between the different figures. It is hard to identify Khosrow among his courtiers, or Shirin among her handmaidens. However, between the first and last picture, the painter did make the king older. In Persia, as in other countries of Islam, prohibition was never absolute. To get around the hadith, the religious laws based on the Prophet's words, artists gradually invented a make-believe world. Pure and arbitrary colours, the absence of shade, of modelling, of perspective, buildings reduced to geometric shapes are constant reminders of the imaginary nature of this painted world. If the representation is not realistic, how can it contravene the laws? The open frame is a form of question. Could the figures and forms of the represented world pass into the real world? Could they come out of the book as the good and bad genies in tales do? These margins stand as proof that there are two worlds, the real and the represented. However, certain censures were strictly imposed, especially in Persia. From the 16th century onwards, the figure of the Prophet had to be veiled. The Mi'raj of Muhammad, his nocturnal ascension to heaven, preceded by the angel Gabriel, is depicted 3 times in the manuscript. The two faces are hidden by veils. There were often periods of iconoclasm in the territories conquered by Islam. Faces on statues were hammered off. Heads of miniatures were decapitated with a brushstroke. The manuscript did not suffer this fate. Made in an unknown period, the only concession to prudery can be seen in the wedding night scene. The naked parts of the two lovers' bodies were smudged, possibly by a finger covered in saliva. Shi'ism resulted in the coexistence of a literal meaning of the Quran and of a hidden meaning, or even several layers of hidden meanings. Likewise, Persian poets enjoyed playing with secret meanings. People looked for allegories in the poetry of each period. The lover in search of his mistress and the constantly postponed encounter could be metaphors for the soul seeking the mystical bond with God. It is hard to find such double meanings in the pictures. Even if realism is excluded, the scenes recount the stories of very real human beings. This special relationship with pictures had other consequences. The manuscript opens with an illuminated double page, and each of the epic poems begins with a decorated frontispiece. The main motifs are of plants and flowers. Metaphors of plant fertility abound in the Quran, a text written in the midst of a people living on the edge of an infertile desert. Stems, tendrils, flowers, leaves, flore are among the most common figures in Islamic art. These ramified shapes curve this way and that, forming accolades, alveolars, or compartments. And in turn, this compartmentation is repeated by parallel or inverted symmetry to create intricately patterned holes with stunning optical effects. Some critics have interpreted such patterns as a mathematical transcription of the divine inspired by the ancient Greeks. The pleasure of a perfectly geometrical design being one of the sources of beauty. Others believe these images reveal an atomistic conception of the universe, a conception also inherited from the Greeks. In a nature that is never changing, the divine will imagines the atoms of creation at each instant and recomposes them. These brightly colored figures, which cover every inch of a surface and convey a sort of fear of emptiness, appear everywhere. Buildings covered in tiles with repeated or inverted motifs. The curves of arches or of domes disappearing under the profusion of muqarnas. Carpets with interlocking and constantly recurring motifs. Walls, spirals, interlacing and arabesques of this supernatural plant world provide the final key to this graphic variation. The image conjured up by these proliferating devices is that of the garden. A Persian invention with its protected enclosures, its canals irrigating rare species, its kiosks and woods conducive to contemplation, the garden filled the Arab conquerors with wonder. In it they saw a foretaste of the stay in the Garden of Eden promised to believers after death. The Garden of Paradise features in all Persian art and in most manuscript illustrations. Allusions to rivers filled with water, wine, milk and honey of paradise are frequent. Greenery, ornamental lakes, streams, carpets of flowers, all imbued with mystery, form this place of sensuality and spirituality of which poets sing. And with its sumptuousness, its tactile and visual qualities, its illustrations bursting with colour, all offering themselves to the reader like a series of enclosed areas, isn't the manuscript itself a paradise? When she speaks, it is 1,000 charming troubles, 100,000 tender kisses. Her lips are worthy of them. Ruby lips, teeth as pure as pearls, before her face as charming as the moon, one loses one's reason, and her curly black hair confuses both the heart and the soul.